So we've done all the bits in yellow, and we're going to look at how did this movement relate to the Jewish communities. Another very nice book by this guy, Juan Marcos Beranjo Guterres, this Jewish rabbi. He talks about the Judaisms of Jesus followers. So he's done a whole research about this. And they were actually called Notzrim at this time, after Jesus' crucifixion. And he talks about how they related. And it's quite interesting because he says that some of his followers were Jewish, obviously Nakdimon, Pharisee. Nathaniel was a Sadducee, and probably John, his beloved disciple, was a priest. I haven't got time to talk about that. So if he was a priest, he would have been part of the Sadducees. The disciple, I've said this, then the zealots, Judas was a zealot, it would seem, because he kept wanting to destroy the Romans. And then most of them were Ham Aretz, or the Galileans. So they were known by a number of names, not by the name Christians. They were known as Notzrim, which means follower of the Netzer, the root of Jesse, the root of David. And that's where the name Nazarenes come from. It doesn't come from the word Nazareth. Nazareth comes from the same word Notzrim, or etc. So, and they were also known as Yeladim, or children, Halacha. Yeladim, or children of the way. Halacha is the way. So when Jesus said, I'm the truth, the life, and the way, that was one where some of them were also known as that. They were not called Christians until very much later, when Gentiles started coming in the diaspora, and it was initially actually a derogatory term. We also know that the early Jewish believers in Yeshua were all Jewish. They continued worshiping the temple, keeping kosher. They were just another sect within the 24 sects. They were now a new sect. Okay, sure, they were seen as heretical by some of the people, but they were accepted amongst the Jewish community. They were allowed in the temple, etc. As long as they didn't speak about Yeshua and his resurrection, it was fine, sort of thing. And then we know that the disciples spent a lot of time in the temple, probably where Yeshua spent time with them teaching in the Solomon's portico. Because remember when he said it was after 40 days, stay in Jerusalem, wait for the promise of the Father. And it always talks about this upper room. Well, there were these upper rooms on the Temple Mount. You couldn't have fitted so many people into the room that the tourists take you to today. And also, remember, they poured out of there, and there were 3,000 people right where they were. There couldn't have been 3,000 people in the street outside, in the narrow streets of Jerusalem. They must have been up in a temple. And that's why when Shavuot or Pentecost happened, they were there when the Spirit fell on them, and they spoke in the languages that they haven't learned. And the Olim, all the people who were there for the Feast of Shavuot, heard them speaking in their own languages, probably giving a gospel message in a sense, if you were to use a term that we would understand, I suppose. And so that's probably where it happened. And it says the whole house was shaken. And there we have the word Habayit again, the house. And that was the name given to the temple of God. So that's why we think it happened there. And in fact, recently, the archaeologists have found a few of these massive baptismal pools, mikvahs. They can take about 1,000 people at a time. And they were just, here's the temple steps, they were just down below these temple steps. So if you're looking at my arrow, a bit further down from where this arrow is, sort of where I've placed this. So Shimon would have probably been speaking on these temple steps to the people gathered, the 3,000 people gathered down below when he gave his whole message. And we know 3,000 people responded. And a little bit later, 5,000 people responded. So it was probably also in the temple precincts. And then we talk about now the light becoming the light to the Gentiles, because these people, these Olim, who were there for Shavuot, would have gone back to their countries, their nations where they came from, to their homes, and they would have started spreading this news. And that's how it started to spread. And then we have some interesting situations that happened. You know about the stoning of Stephen. Some of Yeshua's disciples, quite a few of them, were persecuted for teaching about the Messiah. Some of them were thrown in prison and so on. And when it says that Shaul was involved in the stoning of Christians, they weren't called Christians yet. This was the stoning of other Jewish people. So he was stoning other Jewish folk that he believed to be a heretic. And as you guys know, when Paul and Silas were jailed in Macedonia, that was also for preaching. So he had some of his own medicine, and many times, I mean, he was whipped and beaten to within inches of his death. And he, in fact, also almost died. He was left for dead in Lydda and in Turkey, and he survived that. But I want to mention two things about Paul. In the Apostles' writings, there's a heading you'll notice in your Bible. It probably says the conversion of Shaul or the conversion of Paul. And they talk about him being his name changing because he became a Christian now. The first issue is that there is no passage in the Apostles' writings which talks about a Jewish person being converted. It only talks about somebody from the Gentiles, a pagan, who was converted to the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So to say that Jews become converted and become Christians is not a correct term. And you'll also see why in a minute when we get a little bit further down the line. The other issue is that Shaul was his Hebrew name, but he was born with the name Paul because he was born in the diaspora. Initially in the Greek territory, but when he was born, it was a Roman territory, and he was given that name, which was probably a Roman name, I would guess. So he didn't change his name at conversion. We know he was from the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee trained under Gamaliel I, and he was very proud of that, of his training. So now what happened? How did these early non-Jewish folks start coming into this Jewish faith? Remember, the Jewish believers in Yeshua would have had no contact with non-Jews, particularly those living in Israel. They wouldn't have eaten with them. They wouldn't have had contact because, remember, they were idol worshippers. They sacrificed to idols. The Romans particularly, they had idols for everything. Even the emperor was a god. So they would have had no contact with him. So now we have Shimon, Peter, in Jaffa, Joppa, which is today Jaffa. He's sitting there on a smelly roof of Simon the tanner. It pongs like mad, and he's sitting there and he sees a sheep with all sorts of treif or unclean animals coming down, and a voice says to him, take and eat. And Shimon says, there's no ways am I going to eat unclean animals. That's part of the Torah commands. Absolutely not. I refuse. And the voice says, don't call unclean what I have made clean. So most Christians today think that means, Christians can now eat any food they like because of this particular thing, like pork or prawns or whatever the case might be. But anyway, just as this has happened, these guys appear from the servants of a Roman centurion who invite them to come and eat at his home. So Peter or Shimon starts getting the message, oh, well, maybe I can go with these guys to this centurion's home because of this vision I've just seen. And so he agrees to go to the Roman's home. And we know that while he was there, the Holy Spirit falls on these Gentiles. They start to speak in other languages, again, as it happened at Shavuot, at Pentecost. And now then he realizes that they have been made clean by God as well. And he says so on 2 occasions that now he understands what this vision meant, that they were to be part of the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's what happens. And if we have some doubts about this, it was actually prophesied. He says, I'll pour out in Joel, I'll pour out my spirit on all people. And he says, everyone who calls on the name of Yod-Heh Vav-Heh will be saved. It was about all people. So they remembered that. And in fact, a little bit later, Paul and Simon and all the guys are in Jerusalem. They have this major conference. And by the way, it's Jacob, who's in charge of the newly formed, if you want to call it, church, the Kahila, not Peter. And Paul has been traveling around the Mediterranean, sharing his message, and many of the Gentiles respond. And at first, the Gentiles who responded were proselytized. They were circumcised. They became converted to the Jewish faith and so on. But there were so many numbers. The numbers were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It caused this massive controversy in the early church. What do we do with them? And they have this meeting with all the elders, and they're meeting there. And Shimon Peter is there too. And he tells the story about the Roman centurion. And they say, do they need to be circumcised? This was the issue. Do they need to proselytize, be circumcised, and be converted to Judaism? Or can they be, like that term I used earlier, gerim, part of the faith? And the whole issue is, can we meet together? Can we eat together? Can we have fellowship together? Because if the Gentiles who were coming to faith in Yeshua were still sacrificing to idols, eating meat sacrificed to idols, which, you know, came up in Colossians and all these other places, still living in immorality, which they did, you know, all the orgies that the Romans did, that they were still being cruel to animals. They were strangling animals, other ways of killing animals so that the blood could be, and they were involved in blood sacrifices or drinking blood or whatever it was that they did. There was no ways they could have fellowship around a table. So this was the issue. And then this is what Yaakov says. Brothers, hear what I have to say to say. Shimon, or Peter, told in detail what God did when he first began to show his concern for taking among the Gentiles a people to bear his name. Interesting, they would bear his name. And the words of the prophets are in complete harmony with this, for it is said that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, that is, all the Gentiles who have been called by my name. And therefore, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols. There you have the idolatry. From fornication, there you have the immoral living and the orgies and everything else that they did. There you have the strangled, and there you have the blood. So those four things, if they did that, they could have table fellowship with the Jewish believers in Yeshua, and it would be fine. And then he goes on to say, because from the earliest times, Moses, the Torah, remember the parasha, has been read in every city. You know, it's by those who proclaim in the Jewish folk, with his words being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. And as we know, that the early believers all went to Shabbat, every Friday evening and Saturday. And we know that the early Gentiles did that as well, because wherever, you know, etc. And Paul and the other guys did the same. They went to the synagogue, and that's where Paul preached every time beforehand. So anyway, the point is that what he's saying is that as long as that's okay, those four things, and by the way, those are the Noahide laws, the laws given to Noah after the flood on what they could and should not do. And then he's saying they'll get that, and afterwards they're going to hear the Torah, and their lives will change as they get bathed in the word, as they hear the scriptures read. They will get the message, because it's actually it's to be an instant Jew is almost impossible. It is impossible. You know, it takes a while to understand all these things. So there we go. So now we come to the writings of the apostles, and I just wanted to say, to remind you that they were all Jewish. And I think that Luke was also Jewish for three reasons, that I'm just going to give you one of them. If you read Romans 16, where Paul is greeting everybody, he says, greet my family, and amongst them is a guy called Lucius, which is the Latin name for Luke. So it could well be that Luke was also Jewish. And anyway, I won't spend time on the others. But then just to say, you know, we don't realize that these writings were circulated hand to hand from town to town. And at first, they only had one letter here, another letter there, then they copied them and so on. And they only became what we know as the New Testament, the canon, for the Catholics in 382 of the Common Era. They weren't written then, they were written before the temple was destroyed, but they only became accepted as inspired word of God. and then the Greek Orthodox in 693 of the Common Era, and then in the Protestants in 1563 in the Church of England. So that's quite an insight. And then a lot of people say that the New Testament or the Apostles' writings are negative towards Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism. Well, if you have a look at the book of Acts, there are 148 verses which deal with anything related to their attitude towards Judaism. 78 are critical and 70 are affirming. So if we look at the 78 that are critical, what was it about? It was about persecuting the believers in Yeshua, most of them. The other was the rejection of Yeshua as the Messiah. That was also critical. And only 9 of them were dealing with legalism or hypocrisy. Now, the legalism, we're talking now about the traditions of the fathers. And they obviously said something to some of the guys who said, you can't do this, but they were doing it themselves. And then of the 70 that were positive, what were they? They identified as part of Judaism. We see that. They had very positive attitude to the law of Moses. They quoted from it the whole time. They had a positive attitude to the rabbinic tradition in many other issues, apart from some of these ones over here. The synagogue, we know, was central to their worship, and they saw religious Jews as righteous. So it's not actually right to say that the apostles were anti and that the New Testament is a anti-Semitic book. And then what does Paul say about the status of Gentile believers in the early church? And I think this is something I want to actually put up and frame on my wall somewhere, because he says, therefore, remember your former state, you Gentiles by birth. That's all of us. At that time, you had no Messiah. You were estranged from the national life of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenants, embodying God's promises. You were in this world without hope and without God. And we need to understand that we didn't invent what we call Christianity today. This is what we became part of this. We became part of the Messiah. We became part of the national life of Israel. We became part of the covenants. We had hope with God because he says, but now you who were once far off have been brought near through the shedding of Messiah's blood. And I think that's a very important passage for us in the church to understand, because then maybe we would stop being so negative about it. And the issue was that the Gentile followers who became Christians or became called Christians in Antioch, as I said, it was a derogatory term around the year 60 of the Common Era. That was when they were first called that. And now you will see here, I'm starting to say the joining, parting, and rejoining of Jews and Christians. They were Messianic Gentiles, and so you could say that they are Messianics. The Christians were actually, because Christian is the English translation of Messianics. Does that make sense? I think so. So now we get to the Jews and the Gentiles, the parting of the ways. And this is an amazing book by a guy, a Hebrew rabbi. He's probably they think he's the most the leading Jewish scholar today. He lives in California. He's a rabbi, and he talks about borderlines, the partition of Judeo-Christianity. And it's a lovely book. Daniel Boyarin is his name. If you can get this one, or I tell you, the book you really want to get is called The Jewish Gospels by Daniel Boyarin. He has some amazing insights. He's not a follower of Yeshua, but really it is a worthwhile read. Now, I want to ask you a question. Would you walk into a 90-minute movie in the last 20 minutes and expect to know what is going on? Do I see any hands? I see Jill hiding behind her phone, but I don't see anybody raising a hand. Well, exactly, because that is the situation if one only reads the Gospels, the Epistles, and Revelation. In other words, the Apostles' writings. Because I've counted up how many chapters and verses there are in the Tanakh versus the Apostles' writings, and you get this ratio of 20 minutes out of a 90-minute movie. So it just doesn't make sense to say that we can just do that. But the problem is that the Gentile believers, this ever-growing group of Gentile followers outside of Israel, most of whom did not understand the Jewish roots, could not interpret the Hebrew scriptures correctly, and started applying Greek ways of thinking to the scriptures. They knew and loved Plato and Socrates, who were Greek philosophers, but they did not know the Hebrew scriptures, and some of their doctrines even took on some of this thinking, which I'm going to show you as we go along, which caused this whole split. Now, this picture was drawn, and I won't say which pope, but a very recent pope, when trying to show the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith. He was trying to be conciliatory, and he said, here's the church, and he said, there are the Jewish roots. Now, when one sees it like that, you can see he doesn't understand that we had thousands of years of Jewish scholarship understanding the Torah before we even pitched up, before the time of Yeshua. It's not just that 79% of the Christian Bible is Hebrew scriptures. And so, how can we say that it looks like that? I think it looks far more like this, particularly if you take into account the countless faithful Jewish followers of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you don't believe me, go and look in Hebrews chapter 11. There's a whole list of them. They were Jewish. They were before Yeshua came, and they were faithful. They were called faithful, and so on. So now, what happened? How did this all happen? Well, remember, Paul speaks about an olive tree. I love this because of the wild olive group that we were part of. And he says that, actually, I must give you some history first. First of all, Paul says that the olive tree is Israel, and he's trying to make a point when he's writing to the church in Rome. So what happened in Rome? In 41 of the Common Era, Claudius, the emperor, banned all the Jews from Rome. The Gentiles took over the leadership of the church there. Remember, they were a mixed church, Jewish and Gentile believers together. 13 years later, in 54 of the Common Era, Nero becomes the Caesar, and he knows that the Jewish folk help the economy, so he invites them to return. They return, but the Gentile leadership of the Roman church now had become arrogant, and they would not let the Jewish folk back into leadership positions. They obviously had disagreements about certain things. And then Paul, a couple of years later, in 62 of the Common Era, writes, and he says to them, don't be arrogant. So in Romans chapter 11, we see that he's saying, look, that's what he's talking about. Don't be arrogant. He says it's dangerous if you don't know the Tanakh well. And he explains that we are a wild olive. We've been grafted in through faith, through trust, and that some of the folk have been broken off through lack of trust. Now, what does it mean to have lack of trust? I mean, I know there are Jewish folk today who are called Jewish, who don't go to synagogue. Maybe they pop up on the 3 major feast days. Some of them don't believe that God exists. Some of them call themselves atheists. Others say they're agnostics. But they are Jewish because it's part of a nation. And it's very much like many Christians that you might know, that we're all called Christians, and you'll see how that developed just now. We're called Christians, but in fact, many of them don't even think of the Bible, don't pray, don't go to church. Some might be submarine Christians that pop up on Christmas and Easter, but it's the same thing. They're not trusting God as their Father. They don't have a relationship with Him. So that's who these guys are. And then he goes on to say that this is Romans chapter 8, 9, and 10. The 3 whole chapters explain everything that the Gentiles have come from the Jews. In Romans 9, he says, the people of Israel, they were made God's children. The glory, the Shekhinah, has been with them. The covenants are theirs, not were theirs, are theirs. Likewise, the giving of the Torah is theirs. The temple service and the promises are theirs. The patriarchs are theirs. And from them, as far as his physical descent is concerned, came the Messiah. So he does a whole drash, a drash. Paul does a whole teaching of the 16 chapters of Romans. All of Romans, I think, is leading to this. Most folks say we don't know what those 3 chapters in Romans 9, 10, and 11 are. Where did they come from? Well, he's trying to explain all of this, that he was leading up to it. And he makes it clear over and over again that the Jewish believers in Yeshua do not become Gentile, and the Gentile followers of Yeshua don't become Jewish. He says, stay in the calling to which you were called, because remember, if they merged, then the mission of Israel can't be fulfilled. They had to be alike to the Gentiles worshipping together as Jew and Gentile, two different groups. You know, the one new man, they had to be of two different groups, like man and woman had to be different to be worshipping together. Does that make sense? Anyway, then he goes on and he says that the tree draws its sap from the roots, it's well nourished and produces much fruit. And there we have the patriarchs and all the things I mentioned just now. But unfortunately, what happened as the Gentile church came in and they didn't understand the Hebrew scriptures and that was their roots, they broke off. And it was prophetic, if you like, what Paul was teaching there, because the Gentile cut themselves off with their parent, with the root. And there you can see they believed everything started with Jesus. They have nothing to do with that. And I think that that's where the root of anti-Semitism and the cruelty of the church over the centuries has come from. And I think it's also related to why we have so many divisions in the Christian church today. You'll see why. I'll mention that in a minute. Anyway, what happened then? We have the destruction of the temple. Remember, we're talking about what caused the parting of the ways. Now, when the temple was destroyed, so now we're looking more at history. In 66 of the Common Era, war broke out between the Zealots and the Romans, and the Jewish followers of Yeshua remembered what Jesus had said in Luke. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you are to understand that she's about to be destroyed. Those in Yehuda must escape to the hills. Those inside the city must get out, and those in the country must not enter it. So many fled to Pella. And now, I'm not quoting scripture now, but that's what happened. They went to Pella in the mountains of Jordan. They left their Jewish brothers to fight the Romans, and it was seen by the Jewish folk who didn't believe in Yeshua as a major betrayal. And it caused a serious split, but not a complete one, because when we get to the war, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was 132 to 135 of the Common Era, we find that there were some, according to Josephus, who wrote the Wars of the Jews, that when Bar Kokhba led this revolt, some of Yeshua's followers actually fought alongside them. But then Rabbi Akiva in 133 proclaimed Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah. And obviously the Yeshua's followers would not accept this. And so again, many of them fled. Those who didn't flee, who couldn't get away, Bar Kokhba had them killed because they would not accept Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. That's a terrible thing. Now that caused a serious split between the Jewish followers of Yeshua and the other Jews. At this point, remember, it's not Jews and Gentiles splitting, it's Jewish followers. And then they went and they hid in the hills. They stayed there. Later, Bar Kokhba the revolt was crushed, and Akiva then said that Bar Kokhba was a liar and called him Bar Kosiba, the son of a liar. That's what it means. But the Jewish followers of Yeshua still saw them part of Judaism, but as unwelcome guests. And then if we look at this red line here, that is where the Roman Empire was. And the red areas here is where the Jewish people fled to by about 100 of the Common Era. And the yellow was where they fled to by about 185 of the Common Era. So you can see that actually now these, we don't know how many of them were Jewish believers in Yeshua, but I'm sure there would have been among them. And of course, the believers in Yeshua, both Jew and Gentiles, were spreading the gospel. So you can see how it would have started to spread all over the Hellenized areas, the Roman Empire, and the Gentiles were joining up fast, and the light to the Gentiles was gaining momentum. So we get to this book by this lady, Louise de Chesnay. I'm assuming it's a woman, Louis, I'm not sure. How did the beliefs of the early church develop? And we're looking at the foundation to the end of the 5th century from the beginning. And I'm just going to mention a few things that happened and who these people and groups were. So the belief of the various Yeshua followers, both Jewish and Gentile. Okay, I'm going to deal with the Jewish ones first. The one group I mentioned, the Nazarenes or Nazarenes, they followed the Tanakh. Remember, they didn't have a canonized writings yet. They followed the writings, the Torah and the prophets and the letters that they got. They kept the Torah and so on. The Ebionites they kept the Tanakh, the whole Tanakh, but only followed Matthew's gospel, and they didn't follow any of Paul's writings. And then you have the Judaizers. Oh, by the way, the Ebionites shared all their goods. They became poor. They were sort of living in a communism, community kind of stuff. Then you have the Judaizers. They insisted that the Gentiles coming in must proselytize, must be circumcised and become part of the Jewish nation. And then there were others who accepted the Gentiles as Gerim. In other words, part of their community, but not circumcised. Okay, so those were the Jewish followers. Then among the Gentile followers, you have those who had in the early days proselytized, that converted Judaism, become circumcised. They were the ones some of those who insisted that the Gentile believers be circumcised, be exactly the same as these group. Because if it happened to us, why shouldn't it happen to these other Gentiles as they come in? And then there were those who were Gerim, they were accepted. And amongst the Gentile followers, there were some that kept their pagan practices. And if we understand this concept, then we know why Paul went bananas. Well, first of all, the pagan practices, remember that ruling in Acts 15 and Acts 21 about the Noahide laws, to get rid of those things. Paul went bananas with certain groups like the Corinthians, who were still doing some of these things, and that's why he's very scathing with them. And a little bit he does the same thing to the Colossians. He says some of the same things so about that, but he also goes off about the Judaizers. And we see in Galatians particularly, and a little bit in Colossians, we see he goes off about the Judaizing. And people, I certainly misunderstood this for years. I battled with this until I saw the historical context and saw how this thing had developed. And all of a sudden, it just started to make sense that, okay, well, now I can understand how all of this happened. So let's have a look at some of the early church beliefs. There was a very good book, or not, an early book in the first century called the Didache, which was very pro-Torah and loving your neighbor and following the whole idea of Mosaic law, love of God and neighbor, describes the observance of Jewish traditions alongside baptism and the recitation of Our Father. So that was the first century that's writing. Now, then in the second century, we have another book called the Epistle of Barnabas, and shows a very Gentile Christianity. And we see some interesting things coming through here that weren't so much in the earlier scripts, writings and so on. And the divide between the communities continued to widen, which we see in a book, some writings called the Geza Vermes, which writes that after Hadrian's suppression of the second Jewish revolt, the Jewish followers of Yeshua quickly became a minority group in the newly established church. And at that point, we can see Christianity becoming distinctly non-Jewish religion late in the second century. And the Jewish followers either rejoined their Jewish peers or became part of the new Gentile church. They couldn't have a foot in both worlds. Today, fortunately, we have Messianic congregations where that is possible, but they couldn't do that, so they had to choose one or the other. And so we see that problem, the same dynamic amongst some Jewish folk who come to believe in Yeshua. They become totally Christianized, Gentilized, if you like. Others, I've got friends who are within the synagogue who believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, but they continue in their synagogue and so on. And one can understand why. And then, of course, luckily, as I said, we've got some of the Messianic fellowships. Now, I'm just going to mention a few of the early church fathers' rhetoric, and I'm going to take some of the negative stuff because it's the point that I want to make. Marcion, who was an early church father, was excommunicated in 144 of the Common Era for heresy. And what did he say? He said the God of the Old Testament was not the same God as the New Testament, and so he was excommunicated. Now remember this phrase because it comes up a bit later, but I've heard this in our churches, and I see some of our pastors, not our pastors, our congregation nodding when this is said. And on the TV, you see this kind of stuff being said all the time. And then we have some of these guys, I'll go quickly. Justin Martyr, who had this dialogue with a so-called Jewish guy, I think he made him up, where he actually defeats his discussion about Judaism or the Tanakh and the Torah. And then we have Eusebius, who was one of the leaders of the church Nicaea had a huge impact on the early church. And he said they are perverse, dangerous, and criminal sect. This is talking about the Jewish people. The Gregory of Nyssa said the Jews were infidels. St. Augustine said the Talmudists were falsifiers. In other words, they lied about certain things. St. Ambrose accused them of despising the Roman law, obviously to get them into trouble with the Romans. St. Jerome claims the Jews were possessed by an impure spirit. St. Cyril of Jerusalem claimed that the Jewish patriarchs were a low race, although he spent a lot of time studying with them and learning from them, but then he goes on like that. And then we have John Chrysostom's 6 sermons, scathing attack on Jewish life, anti-synagogue and anti-the festivals. So he was known as the man with the golden mouth. So he preached very, very eloquently, and a lot of people wrote down his sermons, and these are where those come from. So just to say that I must be fair here, that Rome also caused the separation. They had attacks on the Jewish people, the proselytes. They persecuted anybody for living a Jewish life. Funny enough, they saw the Christians and the Jewish folk as the same, which is quite interesting, sort of what I've been saying to some extent. And then in 135, Hadrian and, forgotten his name, Titus, they changed the name of Israel to Syria Palestina, after the traditional enemies of Israel, the Philistines, and they named Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. And then they were barred, as you know, from Jerusalem. The Jewish folk were barred, but not the Gentile believers from Israel, from Jerusalem. And then in 380 of the Common Era, they became the state religion. And then you know also that the Jewish believers in Yeshua and the Christians were persecuted if they did not sacrifice to the Roman gods. The Jewish people actually had a special dispensation among the Romans until Constantine, Emperor Constantine, and he and Licinius legalized the Christian religion. And that brings us to, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to go back a bit to what was happening amongst the Jewish folk from the time when the temple was destroyed. Because the split also had impetus from their side to some extent. So I'm going back to see 70 at a place called Yavne, which was between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, if you like, Jaffa. And that's where modern Judaism was born. A rabbi by the name of Yochanan ben Zakkai laid the foundation of the Jewish survival, because they had to see, what do we do? We don't have a temple anymore. How do we survive? And he got permission from the Romans to bring the greatest Torah sages to Yavne, those who hadn't been killed. And they formed a great yeshiva, reconstituted the Sanhedrin, and so on. And that's where it started. And I can't go on because there's a hang of a lot of amazing stuff to understand how Judaism developed at that stage. But it brings us to the whole thing of where the Talmud started, because it started at Yavne. So we have the Talmud, which is made up of books like the Gemara, the Mishnah, and so on. And they form the writings of modern Judaism. And you will notice it formed, if you look at the timing, it formed at the same time as Christianity was developing and forming its roots. Here's the Protestant revival. Here we have some of the big sages. And then here's where Christianity, particularly this time, was where the Gentile Christianity was developing. And then what happened to try and counteract the growing Christian influence amongst the Jewish people? The sages of Yavne added what was known as the Birkat Haminim, which is against the heretics. And this is a phrase, they added this into the standing prayer that I read earlier, the Shmoneh Esrei, which at that stage had only 13 verses. They added one to make a 14th. And it said, for the apostates, let them be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted. Obviously talking about the Romans there. Let the Notzrim, there they are, the followers of Yeshua, and the Minim, the other heretics, be destroyed in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord. But the point being is, you see, what they would say is, no Yeshua-believing person is going to say this, because he'd be cursing himself. So that's how they distinguished who was a believer in Yeshua and who was not. And then Another thing developed in the Talmud, the name Yeshu, which was said to be a shortened version. What's it? Not acronym. Yes. Yimash Shemo Vezichro, which means may his name be blotted out. Now, that may or may not be so, because Yeshu can also be apparently an abbreviation of Yeshua, and Yeshua is an abbreviation of Yehoshua, so it may or may not be the case. But anyway, I thought I should mention that. And then some of the Jewish leaders also caused some separation over time. In 135, a guy called Tarfon said to the folk, when they were burning gospel scrolls, then the Jewish folk don't have to rescue them, because you see, they were sacred scrolls. If it was a Torah scroll, the Jewish person would rescue them on the Sabbath, but not if it was a gospel scroll. In the 2nd century, they gathered wood for the burning of Polycarp. He was one of the church fathers. They stoned certain apostates. There was a revolt in 351 against Constantine's son, with many Jewish folk who joined in. And then another revolt against Heraclius in those years of the 600s. And then in the Muslim conquests, the Jews initially rose up against their Byzantine rulers, because by that stage, the Byzantines, who were known as, inverted commas, Christians, were treating them extremely badly. So they joined the Muslims at that stage. And then we have this next part. We're moving on. What consolidated this particular split? And